Okay, Oscar in Napa, California. Welcome to the Narrow Path.
Hey, Steve, how you doing? I enjoy your ministry. I learned a lot from it. Hey, Steve, I had a question about Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And somebody told me, I heard this years ago, that it was different races of people came from Noah. Is that true or not? Can you expound on me a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, well, it is true that all the different races of people did come from Noah's family because everyone was wiped out in the flood except Noah's family. So after the flood, there was no one from whom later generations could come except for Noah and his three sons. Now, no more came from Noah himself. He had those three sons, and that's all. So everybody came from his three sons. And in Genesis chapter 10, we have a list of the different nations that came from the different sons. Genesis 10 is usually called the Table of Nations. And it first gives, who the sons and grandsons of Japheth were, and once in a while, great-grandsons. And then it goes on to Ham and talks about who his sons were and his grandsons. And then it goes on to Shem and does the same. Now, some of these names of their sons and of their grandsons are not names that we recognize, but some of them are, and they are actually the names that later became the names of tribal groups that became countries. So, for example, the word Mizraim, one of the sons of Ham. Mizraim, throughout the Bible, is the Hebrew name for Egypt. And Phut, P-H-U-T, or just P-U-T, is the name for Libya, North African country. Cush, now these are all sons of Ham. Cush is the word that the Bible used throughout for Ethiopia. Now, later in the Bible, these words are used to refer to the countries or the nations by these names. But here it's the men who are the progenitors of those nations that are, their names are given. Of course, the nations came from those men. So you can tell, especially, and that's true of a lot of these names in the Table of Nations, you can see that people from Northern Europe, from the Middle East, from Africa, we probably would say further east. No, it doesn't really give real specifics about where the far eastern tribes came from. But essentially, we're told the whole world was overspread from the descendants of these three men. So that would mean that all nations and all races, even races that we would call primitive now, tribal peoples living in the jungles who've, Stone Age tribes to this day, that even they came from them. Now, this really challenges the alternative view of where the nations came from, and frankly the religions of the nations too, because evolutionists who are not believers, they would say that religion began with like Stone Age tribal people beginning to attribute some kind of divine entity or force with the trees and the rocks and the mountains and the volcanoes and so forth, and practice what we call animism today, that there's kind of a spirit in all the inanimate objects, and then that this evolved into these inanimate spirit objects being gods. And so they would carve them into shapes of idols, and they'd worship them. And then eventually they would say, when civilization became much more advanced, then monotheism, the belief in one God, came along. So by this secular idea, the people in the jungles who still worship the rocks and the trees, they're the most primitive religious people. And we who believe in one God, are a much more advanced form of religion. But the Bible teaches the opposite. The Bible teaches that all the sons of Noah, and Noah himself, knew God. They knew about the one God. There was a time after flood where everyone was monotheistic. But Romans chapter 1 says that people knew God, but they didn't want to glorify God, so they changed the image of the immortal God into the image of animals and men and birds and so forth, and began to worship them. In other words, deviations from monotheism came as a result of corrupting an earlier monotheistic understanding of things, so that we could even say that some of the people who are in the jungles in Stone Age tribes, they are the most advanced form of degeneration of religion. Now, many people wonder, how could all the different races come from these three men, since obviously races have physical characteristics that are very different from each other, which they pass on generation by generation to their descendants. How could they all have come from one family? Well, this is not impossible, assuming that the gene pool in Noah's family was particularly rich. There are people today, usually they are biracial people, but the gene pool that they have capable of reproducing offspring in can produce many different colors of children and different characteristics of children. There are actual couples who can produce as many as 9 children, 9 different colors from very black to very white and everything in between. One couple. Why? Because their gene pool is rich. Now, what happens over time is gene pools get narrowed down as people who, let's just say, a couple of people who share some characteristics, they get married and start having kids. Well, the shared characteristics of that couple become rather established in their family line. Now, there would be variations to this general rule, but in general, at least until recent years, frankly, biracial marriage is very common now, and the Bible doesn't indicate there's anything wrong with it. I'm not against it, but for many centuries, people typically married within their own race. And also, even within one's race, people often are attracted to people who, in many respects, share their own characteristics. There are exceptions, but I think you'll find this to be generally true, that people are attracted to persons who look a lot like their own family members or like themselves in many respects. And so, as they get married and have children, their children those traits become rather established in them. So as whole communities, after the Tower of Babel especially, began to separate from one another, my guess, and this is an educated guess, but I'm not saying it's necessarily true, my guess is that people who had a lot of similarities were drawn to each other and became established in communities. And as marriage took place, within the community, then the special traits of those communities became established in those areas. Now, I will also point this out, that most of the darker-skinned people are in the equatorial zones where it's hotter. And the darker your skin is, the more melanin you have in it. And melanin makes you resistant to the harm that the sun can do to you. The northern, North European peoples, Scandinavian people stuff are usually very light-skinned. And they don't get anywhere near as much sunshine as the people in the equatorial zones. You can see that there's been kind of a sorting, a natural sorting of people into the regions where the climate probably suited their characteristics. If you don't have any melanin at all, if you're an albino, you are very susceptible to the dangers of sunlight. So, and the darker skin can tolerate harsh sunlight more. So this is something that may explain why persons who were darker gravitated to the zones where they could flourish and where they suffered no harm from the weather, whereas the people who couldn't survive there gravitated to other areas, so that you end up having the peoples of different geographical areas becoming more established in the same characteristics. And this happening over thousands of years would result, I would think, in having the different characteristics that we call racial characteristics. Of course, there's only one human race, but when we speak of races, we're usually thinking of groups that share certain characteristics. And I think these would become established after, a few dozens of generations of people who are isolated from each other, that is, from other groups. And this is, I think, probably how this all happened. When people say, well, that doesn't make sense, how could all these races come from Adam and Eve or from Noah's family? That doesn't make sense. Well, I'd like to ask, how many times do these atheists think that humans evolved separately on Earth? Do they not believe that all humans came from an original group in Africa? At least all the evolutionists I know. I don't know of any, I've never heard an evolutionist say, no, humanity evolved independently with exact human DNA from ape-like things before them, like in 3 different continents, separately from each other. No, I don't think anyone would. It's hard enough to imagine that it would happen one time. That it would happen 3 or 4 times or 5 times or as many as there are races was ridiculous. Well, no matter whether you believe what the Bible says or you're an atheist and you hold to evolution, you still have to agree humanity arose one place and all the other humans came from those originals, which means we have to acknowledge that all the races of people, because of what we know about genetics, could have come from an original pair or at least original small community, which had a very rich gene pool. And it's sort of like dogs. People aren't like dogs, but they have this in common, that there's one species of dog, Canis familiaris. And there's like 200 different breeds of dogs, and they can look very different from each other in color, in hair distribution, in the length of their hair, in their size, the shape of their bodies. I mean, through breeding, just through recombining the genes of an original pair different ways, you've got all these different, dogs that don't look very much like each other. I would say at least this: human beings, no matter what race they are, they look a lot more like each other, like all others, than some dogs look like others. I don't see much resemblance in a Pekingese and a Borzoi dog. They almost, it's hard to believe they're the same species, but they are. Whereas a black person and a white person and an Asian person, they look a lot more like each other than some of these dogs look like other dogs. So you can see that the genetics of a rich gene pool can be combined and recombined in different ways. And it's easy to see then that different races of people, as we call them, could have come from the same original family. And even if we don't believe the Bible, like I said, even if we don't believe the Bible, I don't know any scientist who would say, the black races, they evolved from, or they came from people who evolved independently from, Australopithecus or something, in Africa. But over in Mongolia, another human race evolved from something over there. They just happen to have the exact same DNA as the ones who evolved in Africa. And then you got some others somewhere else, evolving into the Caucasian people. Now, I don't believe evolutionists would ever go so far. In fact, most evolutionists realize that if evolution ever happened at all, even the first single cell would be a one-off. Evolutionists don't generally believe that there was more than one original cell that everything evolved from. That's because one of the main issues in evolution is they believe in a common ancestry of all living things. And that common ancestry thing is one cell. Well, why couldn't there be 3 or 4 or 10 in different places that started it off? Because it's too incredibly improbable that it would happen even once. They think it had to happen at least once because we have people and animals and so forth, but they're not willing to say it happened twice, much less would exact human DNA evolved separately in more places than one. So all people, whether you're atheist or Christian, came from an original pair or small community. All right, we're going to take a break here. We have another half hour coming, so don't go away. The Narrow Path is listener supported. You can go to our website and use anything for free or donate at thenarrowpath.com.